There were a few early voices that rejected the notion of Egypt as a Near Eastern civilization. Writing in 1911, E.A. Wallace Budge drew on African ethnography to inform his understanding of ancient Egyptian religion, seeing similarities with contemporary practices among Nilotic cultures as evidence for an indigenous Northeast African origin, like the Dinka here, particularly cattle symbolism. However, as Reed points out, this seemingly progressive view was undermined by Budge's contempt for primitive Egyptian religion. He thought monotheism was the way to go, polytheism not so much. Henry Frankfurt was perhaps the most remarkable. In 1948, he argued that in order to understand Egyptian kingship and religion, one should use the ethnography of the, and I quote, groups of people who are the true survivors of that great East African substratum out of which Egyptian culture arose, end quote. In contrast to most Egyptologists, even today, he saw any Near Eastern influence on Egypt's origins as ultimately superficial and adaptive, and I quote, "We observe that Egypt, in a period of intensified creativity, became acquainted with the achievements of Mesopotamia, that it was stimulated, and that it adapted to its own rapid development such elements as seemed compatible with its efforts. It mostly transformed what it had borrowed, and after a time rejected even these modified derivations." The famous Narmer palette illustrates this principle. Most of its iconography is distinctively Egyptian. Narmer's pose of slaying an enemy endured for millennia, and the cattle imagery of the goddess Bat Hathor and King Esbul were also enduring Egyptian symbols, and again, affiliated with that African cattle pastoralism. The one Mesopotamian motif of a serpopod never became important in Egyptian iconography, perhaps borrowed from an object like the cylinder seal, another Near Eastern feature that was quickly adapted to an Egyptian context and eventually abandoned in favor of scarab and stamp seals. Instead, Frankfurt argued that Egypt shared a profound relationship with other East African cultures. In particular, Egyptian kingship and religion was fundamentally different from Near Eastern civilization and strongly connected with the Northeast African cattle complex that survived in modern Southern Nilotic groups like the Dinka, perhaps reflected in ritual practices like the cattle dance, an example of which we found on rock art in Sudanese Nubia. You have to look kind of closely, but at the top there are a group of people dancing, and then a kind of herd of cattle with spots and different colorings down below. And this pre-dynastic figuring is usually interpreted as a similar kind of dancing figure to the Dinka man you see here. Frankfurt's view of Egypt as fundamentally African was not an example of the kind of simplistic and ultimately suspect notion of survivals argued by early anthropologists like Seligman, although Frankfurt does talk about the Hamitic character of the cultures involved. Instead, like Budge, Frankfurt makes a detailed argument for ethno-archaeology. Rather than looking to Near Eastern institutions and cultures to understand ancient Egypt, one should look to other African cultures that potentially share common roots in a regional cultural complex that included cattle pastoralism. An increasing pace of archaeological work in the Sahara, the Oases, and the Eastern Desert, and in Sudanese Nubia, lends support to Frankfurt's notion of Egypt's origins in a Northeast African context, but without his problematic reference to Hamites. During the Epipaleolithic and Neolithic, about 8,000 to 3,500 BCE, the stark contrast between the Sahara and the Nile did not exist, something that Egyptologists have still not largely fully taken into account. With some notable exceptions like Fekri Hassan, who argues that the many features connected with cattle pastoralism in Egyptian religion and kingship ultimately came from the desert, especially imagery surrounding the cow goddess Bat and Hathor. Archaeological and paleoclimate research by scholars like Fred Wendorf and Romad Schild at Nabta Playa, which you can see here on the map, it has transformed our view of the Sahara during the pre-dynastic period. More recently, Africanist Rudolf Cooper from the University of Cologne led an extensive multidisciplinary project that has established the basis for the reconstruction of long-term climate change in the Sahara. Their research has demonstrated that summer rains extended north in Egypt from about 8,000 to 5,000 BC, creating an environment that you see here in these inset photographs. Although a desiccating trend began in the formative Badari and Nagata periods between about 5,000 and 3,500 BC, modern conditions weren't reached in Egypt until the end of the third millennium, 1,000 years after the formation of the pharaonic state, and even later in Sudanese Nubia. The notion that Egyptian civilization developed in isolation along a thin strip of green that bordered the Nile, somehow divorced from the rest of Africa because barren deserts surrounded it, can no longer be sustained. David Wengrow and colleagues have recently embraced a nuanced view of an African origin for pharaonic civilization linked to the wet phase. Instead of development in isolation along the Nile with influence from Western Asia, they see Egyptian civilization as part of the primary pastoral community that emerged in Northeast Africa during the 5th millennium BC, or perhaps even earlier. They state, and I quote, "What came to be shared across this extensive region were the materials and practices, including, perhaps especially, modes of ritual practice, out of which more local contrasts and group identities were constructed." Their position resonates with Frankfurt's notion of an African substratum, while avoiding the pitfalls of older, more suspect models like survivals, diffusion, migration, contained in the Hamitic hypothesis. As they note, and I quote, "is by charting the spatial and temporal distribution of specific cultural practices that the beginnings of a distinctly African context for the later prehistory of the Nile Valley may yet come into focus," end quote. These cultural practices include both symbolic expression and distinctive material culture traditions with ties throughout the region. Our UCLA and UCSB surveys at the 3rd and 4th cataracts of the Nile have made a modest contribution to this picture. For example, this elephant on mountains motif found on rock art at the 3rd cataract is similar to one on the Coptos Colossi, which you can see to the right. In our case, the mountains are rectilinear rather than rounded, perhaps connected to markers along somewhat later Old Kingdom trade routes across the Sahara. A hippo hunt graffito shares a close parallel with pre-dynastic and later pharaonic symbolism that was connected to the king's ritual slaying of the forces of chaos in the form of an animal manifestation of the god Seth. Pottery recovered from our work at the 4th cataract on the left includes widely distributed types like calciform beakers and the very specific technique of ripple varnish, which you see here, which is widely distributed from Upper Egypt in the north, west to the Sahara, into Sudanese Nubia, and as far south as Khartoum. The final argument for Egypt's being in but not of Africa is its supposed limited influence and trade in other parts of Africa compared to the Near East and circum-Mediterranean world. This argument both underestimates Egypt's reach in Northeast Africa and overstates its influence in Western Asia. In fact, the extent of trade and diplomatic contacts are arguably more extensive to the southwest than to the northeast, as you can see here, tracing out various relationships. Only a handful of Egyptian or influenced objects have been found in the Aegean or wider Mediterranean, but matching those are similar luxury items found in Ethiopia and Sudan south of Khartoum. We know mainly from text rather than objects that Egyptian state and diplomatic relations traded with far-off Babylon, but the same can be said for Punt, likely located either in modern Eritrea or Somalia at the Horn of Africa. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence indicates that Egyptian expeditions reached a surprising distance from the Nile Valley. Expedition leaders traveled from Dakhla Oasis, past the Gulf Kabir to Uwainat, and on perhaps to Libya and Chad or Darfur in Sudan. Normally thought of as a Nubian ally and trading partner, a graffiti mentioning yam recently discovered at Uwainat makes the Ineti Mountains in Chad its likely location.